Hey, we are here today at Seacoast Church, and all of us leaders in our respective churches and organizations, I just want to first say thank you. Thank you for being available. Thank you for saying yes to having this conversation today. And I think we all can agree it's been a crazy few months, right? Starting with COVID-19 and then seeing the issues of racism and racial injustice in our country arise, and all of the difference of opinions and perspectives and political bias that maybe surround that. And what I'm thankful for today is that for us around this conversation, what brings us together is the good news of Jesus. And what brings us together is the local church. And today we just want to have a conversation, a healthy conversation, an honest, laid back conversation about the topic of race and what does God have to say about it? What does it mean for us as believers, as Christ followers? And we want to do so and that honors the Lord and also honors one another. So you guys ready to do it?
Yeah. Sounds good.
Well, cool. Well, hey, growing up, I know for me, I grew up personally just around different backgrounds, people with different racial upbringings. And for you, and I want to hear from everybody, what environments, how did you grow up with people of different racial backgrounds, and how has that shaped your view of race today, here and now? So, Craig.
Yeah, I was just thinking about where I was born and raised, Miami, Florida.
Yeah.
And there was not much room to have prejudice or discrimination because everyone around you is different. I grew up with Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Nicaraguans, African Americans, Anglos. You pretty much name it in Miami, it's there. It's a melting pot. So for me to grow up in an international kind of setting, but yet be here in America, was a really great experience for me growing up.
Yeah. How long did you grow up in Miami?
Yeah, so about 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, 20 years I lived there.
Wow.
So loved it. Yeah, it's geographic South, but not the cultural South. Let's put it that way.
Definitely. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. What would you say, Brooke?
Well, I'm one of those people that grew up in Ohio and moved here, so don't judge me. But I grew up in a super small town in Ohio, like one stop sign.
Yeah.
I did not have any interaction with minorities until I got my first job when I was about 16. And then I interacted with people from the city, which were, at a different high school than I was. And so growing up for me, I didn't ever really have to think about race. It was never a conversation that I had or that my parents had with me. And so it was very different from your experience. But I got my first job and I started interacting with people that looked different than me. And then when I was 18, I moved to Columbus, Ohio, which obviously is a lot different than any small town.
Yeah.
And so had a really diverse experience in my undergrad in Columbus, which is also where I met my husband.
Yeah.
And so it was just kind of, I grew up not having any interaction, and then all of a sudden there it was.
Yeah. Wow. Emily, I know you grew up in the Charleston area. Tell us a little bit about how that was for you growing up.
Yeah, I grew up in the good old Goose Creek of Charleston, and I went to a predominantly white private school, and same with church growing up, small church. We were really just kind of a tight-knit community, the private school that I went to and grew up my whole life. I really grew up, although it was predominantly white, I really grew up in a home that just valued race and different ethnicities. And then I went to the College of Charleston, and that's obviously a predominantly white school, and ended up starting a nonprofit that serves different races. And I don't know.
That's cool. That's cool. And Robbie, where did you grow up?
I grew up 5 minutes down the street from where we are right now.
Wow.
In Mount Pleasant, South Carolina.
Yeah.
So, my background growing up, I feel like I was from a very diverse, Mount Pleasant was a lot more diverse back then when I was growing up, when I was a lot younger. And my school that I went to right down the street, I was introduced to lots of races from a very young age, even international students. Like, I remember one of my earliest memories in kindergarten is my friend Tom Yuckel. He was from the Czech Republic, and He had an accent and he spoke a different language, but I would literally go home and make up words and present them to him the next day at class and ask him what I said. Just like I was so fascinated that he spoke a different language. Like to me, that was just the coolest thing. And he would just kindly be so gracious with me and say, "Robbie, you didn't say anything." But but yeah. So anyway, growing up in Mount Pleasant, it wasn't an issue. I was definitely surrounded by lots of ethnicities, and I was aware of it. As you grow up, you start to become aware of it at a young age. And even the school, I went to a performing arts school here in Charleston for middle and high school. But I don't think I really experienced a ton of negative associations with race until maybe 15, 16, and then on. And then, then it became a lot more, a lot greater at that point.
Yeah.
In that sense. Yeah.
Sure. I know I grew up in the upstate of South Carolina, and a lot of my experiences and encounters with people of different race backgrounds came through sports, honestly. So playing football, playing basketball, and the schools that I found myself in, me and my brother, you don't really get to pick and choose who your teammates are. And a lot of my relationships, a lot of my closest friendships came through sports. And so that's kind of shaped a lot of how I view race even to this day, because, became such good friends with people who are from different walks of life and different backgrounds, and going over for sleepover, going over to hang out, and always feeling welcomed, always feeling cared for and loved. Felt like I belong in those settings. And, my parents, for me, they also tried to create that for my friends when they came over. So, Robbie, I want to ask, so we're talking about race, and maybe it can seem like an uncomfortable conversation. How do you even start? And for someone that's going to be watching, somebody going to be checking this out, like, how does someone start the conversation about race?
That's a great question. And I think one of the most important things to consider when talking about things with race is that race is a part of our identity. It's a part of who we are. So the essential thing for me is that you build relationship with people, and once you build relationship, you start to build a relational credibility. So for example, if me and my wife, like if we're talking or having a discussion that may, for some reason, whatever reason, may feel a little uncomfortable, we have the foundation and the basis of mutual value for each other. We have love for each other. So when she says something that could potentially be offensive, I don't take it in an offensive way, because I know what she actually thinks of me. Good. So I think that's the first place to start at. So I would just encourage people, for sure, is like the first conversation, I wouldn't just go into that, I would actually just, just get to know each other as a person, as an individual. And then as you want to dive deeper in that, and you see value, like don't be afraid of talking about race, because it is a big part of who we are, you know? It's a big part of our culture. And as we begin to appreciate and value that about each other, then that changes the whole tone of celebrating it versus using that as something that separates us.
No, that's real good. That's good. So is there, and this is for anybody, is there a difference between diversity and like racial reconciliation? Like, how would you define those two terms?
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes you can get tangled up in a lot of those terms and try to sort out too much that you don't need to sort out. I love, Robbie, what you're saying about the fact that race is a part of who we are, but it's not the thing that defines us. And too often I think the culture can lend toward trying to deal with a problem by trying to push it away. In other words, to minimize or marginalize, I think, what God has created. And we should really embrace and celebrate that. So God created that diversity. And I think diversity is the way he expresses the beauty of his glory for us in this world. So I think that's one thing. The other thing about, I think, racial reconciliation is I think we've got to realize again that if you look in the Bible, too often I think in our culture today, we seem like we're trying to push toward a reconciliation of something that, from the gospel's perspective, from heaven looking down, we already have unity. We're already united. So instead of trying to fight for it our way, I think if we begin to say, no, the gospel's already fought for it, and we're coming from that point of view, not trying to go to it. And too often, I think in our society, we're not informed by that. So therefore, I think there's a disparity between those two things, diversity and racial reconciliation. if we begin at the right starting point, right?
Sure.
Then I think that's the presupposition that helps us pursue a oneness and a conciliation instead of trying to reconcile something that God already brought together.
That's good.
But we're in a broken world and we're broken people.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that reconciliation also to me is that picture of people walking alongside of each other and kind of just doing life together. Whereas you can have diversity, which, I mean, you can walk into a room and there's different kinds of people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're sharing their experiences and that they're trying to understand one another and walking alongside each other. And so for me, I feel like that's kind of the difference between the two terms.
That's very clear. That's very clear. And I love what you said about having the same like starting point when looking at this. And I want to ask for everyone around, what is a biblical view of racism? What should Christ followers, how should they view racism through the lens of Scripture?
Well, it's a sin. Racism is a sin.
Yeah.
It's both the individual and a collective sin. Racism, it stems from just a prejudice or a racial bias of certain people, and that's that individual. And that's what I love about what you were saying about reconciliation, because diversity it's that exactly what Brooke was saying. You can walk in the room, or I could be at a table, and my table could be diverse, but it might not be reconciled. And so I always think of it as diversity is more like numbers and differences, but reconciliation is relationships and mending and restoring. And so, I mean, just looking through it in the lens of the Bible of racism is a sin, and on that individual level, our job as Christians and what we were created to do and what God sent his son down to earth to do was so that we could be reconciled back to God. And so that's that, that approach of everything that I do, I'm trying to be reconciled back to God. In order for him to do that, I need him to search my heart, and I need him to reconcile myself to him so I can then be reconciled with others. And so when we see it as a sin, we can see it as, as any other sin. And I think sometimes when we hear racism or I'm a racist, we immediately we crumble up and we're like, oh no, I don't do that. And we just immediately close off. But in the same way that we're to take the speck out of our own eye and look at our own sins and look at our own heart. It's just a question that we have to ask of where do we fall? Where do we fall in this sin of racism, and what do we need to do to reconcile ourselves to God and to others?
Yeah, why do you think that? Because you said that like with racism and it's honestly no different than any other sin, but when the topic of racism, when that term comes up, when someone hears that, immediately defense rises up, right? Like, why do you think that is?
I think a lot of it is in how history is taught. So we're taught that a lot of these things are kind of over, right? So like we're taught about history, about American history as like slavery, civil rights, Black American history, right? And Black History Month, slavery, civil rights, and then it's all better. And so for people growing up in the last few decades, there's a lot of question behind, what do we do now? Like everything's better. We passed the Civil Rights Act. We did everything that we need to do. And so I'm not racist. I don't have slaves. Right?
Sure,
I don't do anything actively racist in my eyes. And so it's just hard sometimes to be able to see it's those blind spots that we have.
I think just kind of tying together some of those other questions too, like the greatest command is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that second part for us ends up being really hard, in a lot of ways. And with missing the second part, a lot of times we're missing the first part, But like loving your neighbor as yourself a lot of times boils down to recognizing that there is hurt, recognizing that there are differences, and how can I love you in a way that not only restores you, but restores the value in you and brings you closer to God. We don't always have that perspective, and so when you ask like, why does it feel almost offensive? I think that anybody knows that pride is not necessarily something that's beneficial for us as humans in the way that we're created, but it seeps in sneaky ways all the time.
Sure.
If not, then I wouldn't, I would never think that I'm wrong in my marriage, like I would never think, like when my wife says that there's something going on, like if I were to just come from a position of pride, then I would just deny that there's ever anything wrong with me, or anything wrong with even the situation, and not give any attention to that. But if I really want to love her well, and love God better, then I come down and I get to know her. I get to hear her heart and realize that her perspective is different and unique from mine.
That's good.
And so to love her well means to seek to understand. And I also thought about that scripture. This one keeps coming back to mind when Jesus was with the woman who was caught in adultery, and they were about to stone her. And Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And what the attitude of the people around her in that moment, they were considering themselves separate from her.
Wow.
So whatever she was dealing with was different than what they were dealing with.
That's good.
And so they thought that there was a level, an imbalance there, that whatever she was dealing with deserved to be stoned. And theirs wasn't. And Jesus really, he balanced that back out, and said, whoever is without sin, cast first stone, So I think that, those two working together.
I love that. I love that. It reminds me of the Sermon on the Mount, right?
Yeah.
Jesus says, hey, you say don't kill anybody, but I say if you have hate in your heart, that's the same as murdering your brother. Right. Hey, don't commit adultery yet. If you have lust in your heart, that's the same as committing adultery. Like Jesus leveled the playing field. He raised the bar, and as you were saying, and I couldn't help but think about those stories. Think about the young lawyer who would ask Jesus, who's my neighbor? Right. And Jesus would tell the story of just the Jewish man on the side of the road and the Good Samaritan, and be a neighbor, how Jesus would respond in that. And I think what you're saying, Robbie, and what you both said too, Brooke, is just recognizing the differences, recognizing them, and then being able to humble yourself, to listen to another person, to hear their perspective, to just take a second and just enter into their world. And I love how you said that about the woman caught in the adulterous act. And for all of us, like I said, we're all leaders. And I'd like to start with you, Craig, as your position, a leader in the church here in Charleston. How do you see your role and your position being a part of just the solution and being a part of moving forward together in the topic of racism?
Yeah, I think, again, if we're coming from the premise of the Great Commandment, to love God and love your neighbor as yourself, then the question is, how does the church be the church in that? And not just say it on Sunday and it sounds good, or we can say that comfortably with one another if we're of the same race, right? Or ethnicity, where we're comfortable. But when you get into diversity, that's where the real rub is, because you have to not only deny yourself to love someone, even if they're of your own race, but if you're loving someone who is not like you, you got to empty even more. And I think that's the fundamental issue and struggle. So as a leader, the thing I want to do is to help churches to begin to help their members see themselves as everyday missionaries that carry out the message of the gospel in the way they live Monday through Saturday.
That's good.
I would love for the church on Sunday to display the multi-ethnic picture. If we were really loving each other well, and if relationships were being reconciled together, wouldn't it be wonderful that every church would have a mix of people that are side by side worshiping Jesus? Now, that does not exist, right, to the degree that we would like for it to. But I really want to help leverage my role in the city to help leaders say, let's talk about the Monday to Saturday church, because if it's not happening there, it's not going to happen on Sunday morning.
That's good.
And so it's an everyday relationship. So I love what Brian Laritz talks about, is that making your table the place that you build these cross-cultural relationships. Open your table up. Love people who are not like you. Get to know your neighbors. God provides the diversity around you. Just engage it. And so when we engage that's where I think if we can begin to transform members of churches into missionaries that live with that message, then life on life and a little at a time, relationship to relationship, I think that's where we see a shift to where we look at Sunday and begin to see a different picture. Now, to what degree that Greater Charleston can have a Brooklyn tab and a lot of churches that are completely diverse in every way, I don't know. But I do know that we need to press into that and see where it goes with the everyday disciple perspective. So seeing churches that have the same common focus and then leveraging their strength to help disciple members to think this way, to love their neighbors as themselves and intentionally pursue them. Make sure your address book begins to change about who's in it. They don't just all look like you think like you. That to me is where we see a shift take place.
That's real good. That's real good. And I know, Emily, for you, you have a unique position and unique role, not only being a leader in the church, but executive director of Charleston Hope. How does your position, how did the roles that you carry and have, how does that shape how you view your part in this topic?
Yeah, one of the things I've learned about just tackling racism is kind of 3 L's: listen, learn, and leverage. And so that listen is, listening to people of different races, of their experiences, which starts, at the table. It starts in the living room, having conversations, but it's that intentionality piece of getting to know them and getting to know how racism is affecting them. Because if I'm not close to the problem, I'm not going to truly care about the problem. And so starting there, and then listen, learn, doing the work for myself, and then leverage. This is where that question comes into play of leveraging what I have as a white individual with the white privilege and white advantage that I have, of taking that into the work of Charleston Hope. What we do is we're in high poverty Title I schools. So the majority of our students here in Charleston at these schools are predominantly African American, and the majority of our teachers are white. And so what we look at is how can we tackle racism both in the classroom and in the school as a whole. And so being an advocate for that looks like shifting our resources, shifting our funding to be able to send teachers to trainings on racism and how they can serve students who don't look like them, and moving past just I love all kids, or I love all people, but really looking at the way that racism affects people individually and systemically. And so being, a leader in the church too, I think that's having the knowledge that I have gained over the last few years of really digging into this work of anti-racism. It's, what's the saying of, this is completely not the same, but basically once you know, you can't unlearn something. So once you learn something, you have the responsibility to share it. The work, and so it's just the work of dismantling racism, but also seeing it through the lens of the gospel. It's something that it makes my heart just want to burst, because it's we can't ignore this, and I can't unlearn this. And so I feel that responsibility to help our teachers in schools, but also to help, our small group leaders in churches, and really just to be a person that can sit with somebody and answer the hard questions of I have maybe a little bit more experienced in this work. And I just want to be able to lend my voice and also make sure we're looking at it through the lens of the Bible. Because that can be very easy not to do when talking about racism.
Now you said something at the beginning of that I would like to circle around, and that was the topic of this term white privilege. We probably all heard it. Brooke, would you like to define what does white privilege mean? Give me a definition of that.
Like a dictionary definition or my definition?
You go. I'll let you choose.
So, can I tell a story?
Sure.
So, I have a son. My son is 14. He is biracial, and we're having all kinds of conversations right now and always. But he asked me, we're walking through the Undivided series at our church, and we had lunch a couple weeks ago, and he said, "So, Mom, what was it like for you growing up white?"
Wow.
And I sat there for a minute, and I was not only thinking about the fact that I never really considered what that was like, but also then considering the picture of my husband growing up as a black child, and how I know in his story that was something that he had to think about all the time. Right. And so for me, that's a picture of white privilege, right? Where it's not something that is pointed out to me that I'm white. It's not something that I have to consider or think about when I walk in a room. Often I'm in spaces where I'm around people, lots of people that look like me, and I don't have to try very hard to get there. And so all those things are privilege. Going back to an actual definition, it's just this idea that, you know, I go through life and I have hard things happen to me, right? Like everything isn't handed to me necessarily, but I don't have struggles specifically because I'm white in the way that people of color experience.
Yeah. That's good. And I think sometimes, some of the disconnection can be like, no one's asking you to apologize for the way God created you, right? I would never ask you to apologize for how God uniquely created you, or you, Craig, or you, Emily. And I love that you said that and shared that story. And I can remember personally, and Robbie, I'd love to hear from you. I remember when I started to drive. You know, I remember when I came of the age, I remember my dad and my mom sitting me and my brother down and having that conversation just about, hey, if you are to get pulled over, not if, but like when you get pulled over, this is how you respond. This is how you carry yourself. This is how you respect the officer. And again, not to say that, hey, maybe I wasn't speeding or my brother wasn't speeding, but just understanding that this officer, this person, whatever setting I find myself in, they may look at me and judge me based on the color of my skin. And being a kid and having to really like understand that, and you know, never really experiencing it quite yet, but like my parents experiencing it, and my parents just bringing awareness to me and my brother. And I want to know, did you have similar experiences or run into any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't really talk about it that much, so I think that most people assume that I don't or haven't really. But I just want to. One thing I wanted to say, that was really good what you shared there. I really appreciate that, and I think sometimes when we hear the term white privilege, we get all bent out of shape about it, and we immediately look for defenses. Like, for example, there's like, well, everybody's got privileges. You know, that is true. We all have privileges if we stop and recognize it. But specifically speaking, you know, like for me, my skin doesn't help me when I'm walking down the street. Like if my skin was white, people probably would clench their purses less, you know, or they would probably not avoid me more, you know, less or whatever. So like there probably wouldn't be as many eyes on me in a grocery store. My skin doesn't make me easier to get a loan, you know, accepted in a loan, stuff like that. You know, it's like thinking through other things. Do I let that stop me? No, you know, like I've been blessed to be educated. I've been blessed to almost have my master's degree right now. And that is not something that I take lightly, you know, but it doesn't mean that there weren't challenges along the way. One of the early experiences for me that this became really real, I think I was about 15 years old, and I had a professional singing group here in Charleston. And we recorded a CD. We did a live recording. It was awesome in North Charleston. It was basically like a Christian version of Boyz II Men. It was awesome. And there were 4 of us, 4 singers, and then the band. And afterwards, we were just like celebrating. We went to, I think it was like a local Ryan Steakhouse in North Charleston. And in the middle of our dinner, a whole team of police officers came into the restaurant to our table, and they arrested our drummer. Like in front of everybody. Just picked him up, took him out of the restaurant. My stepdad went out after him, like looking, you know, like, hey, what's going on? What's going on? You know, and the whole response from the cops was, he fits the description of a drug dealer that we were looking for. And so for 15-year-old Black Robbie, you know, I'm thinking, that was so random. Like, we just recorded a concert of Christian music within the confines of our church and are celebrating in a restaurant down the street. Like, where is there a place where you're actually safe from something like this? You know, and I've had my fair share of times even after that of being profiled as well. And so, but like, I think what people don't consider is like, even hearing your story about that, like, I've told stories like this about young people and how they feel seeing these things in media and, you know, and how that affects a young boy or a young girl or whatever. And they're just like, well, doesn't that sound like a media problem?
Yeah.
It's like, it's not a media problem.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and that is like what you said, like, that is, you know, symptoms of white privilege to me, is that the fact that you don't have to think about that, you know, as a kid. So,
That's good.
I want to say that I just want to say that as a white brother to you, my black brothers, that it just grieves me to hear that. And I just lament that has happened to both of you. So I just want you to know that there's so much sorrow I carry in my heart for that. When I think of the example of Christ at Philippians 2, here's the Son of God, right? And what does it say? He laid aside his divine privilege in order to accomplish a much greater good for all.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where, if anything, at the core root of our society that's so broken, is that at the end of the day, we're after one thing, and that is what's best for me. And if you're part of majority culture, it's easier to get the best for me, right?
Yeah.
And so I just want to say that I grieve over that. At the same time, I think I'm so thankful for this conversation, because this is the antidote to the issue, which is the gospel of Jesus. And Robbie, you said it well, the great commandment to love God and love your neighbor as yourself is at the core. And for many people, I think that's too simplistic. Like, no, you gotta have more than that. And I think there's a lot of things that have got to be addressed and dealt with. Systemic issues in culture, I would say even systemic issues in the church. And I think the role of leadership in the church is to deal with those issues. Where's the gospel not informing our lives, or where is it not informing our discipleship strategy? Like, where are we missing the gap? Where are the gaps at that we're not getting? Because we know the gospel is not incomplete. Jesus gave the example: you lay aside your privilege for one purpose, and that's to serve someone else for a greater good. We've got to get to that issue, and that's one of my hearts, Tevin, you're asking about from a leadership standpoint, is Mission Charleston. The goal of that is to connect churches together in order to begin to address where is the gospel not informing yet what needs to be informed. Like, where do we help people go from unbelief to belief? Where have they bought into a system of thinking and belief that's not gospel? Because that's where things begin to change. If we can get down to that root system. And I think churches have got to look at their whole strategy every year to answer the question, what do our pulpits need to say? What do our small groups need to say? And what does my personal life need to say in this issue? And what about next year? How can I begin to move even further in the reality that the gospel is not only for all people, but it requires for all of us to empty ourselves for one another. You know, it's so huge.
That's good. That's good. And I love that. And what I love most about it is, as you were sharing your experiences and even, you know, me not knowing you as well, and maybe for everyone around, just that response, how you respond. I think there needs to be more listening, right? Listening, and
absolutely.
I've heard it said once, not listening with the intent to try to respond, or to try to prove your point, but listening to care, and to encourage and to love. And thank you for just showing that.
Thank you.
That's not scripted. It's, you know, that's, and I think as a Christ follower, and for all of us, we got to be better examples of that.
Absolutely.
Listening to love, right? I think that's what Jesus showed us most in his ministry and his life. You know, I go back to John chapter 4, like Jesus met the woman at the well, and Jesus already knew the answer to her questions. Jesus already knew her situation. He already knew her sin. But he sat there and listened to her, not to learn, but to love. You know, and I think that's great just to see that and to experience that. And I guess for maybe this might be a simple question, maybe it's a elementary question, but Robbie, do you think that do you think black people feel that all white people are racist? Like, how would you speak to that?
No. Simple answer is no. I don't think that at all. I think in the same way that it's really important to not put all black people in the same category is the same way that you don't put any other group of people in the same category. You know? And so, like, for example, there are parts of my culture, in my subculture, that will fit, you know, something that, some assumption that you might have. And there are parts of my subculture that will not fit, you know? And so, like, I can't be the barometer for all black people, you know, and the white people that I've met can't be the barometer for all white people that, you know, across the board and stuff. So I think, yeah, like, taking a more individualistic approach is definitely really beneficial. Like I really appreciate your response here, because for me, it wasn't just like an exchange of information, but it's a valuing of story. And how many conversations do we have in life where we're just like, I want to know what I can get out of this relationship. You know, like, for example, you know, like, I'm a singer, I'm a musician, I'm a performer. So there's lots of conversations where people they really just want me to come work for them, or they really want me to do that, but they don't want to know those stories, you know? So, like, they want to know the part of my story that benefits whatever they're going towards, you know? And so, but I think it takes exactly what you're doing, and, like, what we're all really in this for is we take an individualistic approach, and we say, like, here's where I come from. I want to know where you come from. I want to value that. And you end up creating another culture, like Emily said, like, when you can't unlearn it. Because once you have experienced something better, you don't want to go back.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like, you don't want,
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I want to ask, did anybody, like, did their parents or family members, like, grew up, like, maybe with parents in ministry? Is that, like, a reality for anybody? You're shaking your head, Robbie.
Yeah.
So
I'm a PK.
there it is.
Yeah,
so,
ministry family, but yeah.
So how was that like for you, like being a pastor's kid? Like, how did that shape your view of race and growing up?
I grew up obviously here in Charleston. I was actually presented this question a couple years ago when I was living overseas in Argentina, and somebody asked me, is it true that in America Sunday is the most segregated day in your country?
Wow.
And I said, I have no idea what that even means. That was my response. And then he said, well, I heard that there's like a black church, and there's a white church, and there's a Hispanic church, and an Asian church. And my mind was just blown. I had no response for him. And I was like, you're absolutely correct. I didn't think about it like that. Like, even though at that time I was going to a predominantly white church, but growing up, I grew up downtown, going to church downtown on America Street at Friendship Baptist Church. And my parents my mom was the organist, choir director there, and my grandparents were like involved in, ministry positions there. And then my mom and my stepdad started some churches here in Charleston. And so I grew up, but it was predominantly black church culture.
Sure.
That was my upbringing. I didn't come to Seacoast until I was like 17-ish years old, I would say. Complete culture shock for me when it came to the context of worship. Yeah, absolutely. I even to the point where I was just thinking that some of this was wrong. Like that was my initial response, is like, how do you do the church this way? This is like so it's so different. And the Holy Spirit, I really had to allow the Holy Spirit to minister to me. And the same barriers that I had, I know that tons of other people have too, because I think a lot of times in our culture, we talk about, there's a predominant white culture, and then like if a Latino or a black person or Asian person comes in, then they're having to assimilate to white culture. But it would have been the same way in my church growing up. We had some white families that came in. It wasn't like we were singing contemporary songs. Well, I did later, but for the majority, it wasn't like that, So they either had to assimilate to what we were doing, so that's it's just another picture of like, what is the kingdom dynamic that we're trying to cultivate? And I think the kingdom is more like what you were saying, with a melting pot, like in Miami, like influences of all that. And I've seen that in a couple places, mostly in like Los Angeles, other places. Like I've seen glimpses of that in a lot of ways, but I definitely think as a church, we have some room to grow in that.
Absolutely. So, and moving from that, I think I'm probably the only one here that doesn't have kids. So I want to ask for everyone around, and I know, Craig, your children are much older now and married, and we were talking earlier. And you can chime in this as well. because you have a grandchild now.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah,
So that's
granddad.
awesome. That's awesome. How old?
3.
3.
Oh, yeah.
My goodness, so
Yes.
cute.
great.
But I want to ask for everyone, and honestly, to help learn for myself, but maybe for others as well. And I'll start with you, Emily. How, as a mother, in this topic, and especially with what you do and how you lead Charleston Hope, with you and Andrew, and now little Zion coming up through that, how do you see your role as a mother, as a parent, in shaping his worldview in the topic of racism?
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, I just plain and simply see it as just discipleship. I'm getting to raise up, and God chose me for Zion. That God chose Andrew and I, that we get to raise him up to be a godly man.
Yeah.
And so when I think about specifically racism and the conversations on racism, it's important for us, and Andrew and I, we've talked about this, because with the nature of the work that I do in the schools that I'm in, my children will be around people of different races. But in the same way, that's not enough. That's not enough.
Sure.
And when I think about that, I think either we're going to teach him, or culture is going to teach him, because our culture is a racist culture, and it's a sinful culture. And we have to see it as in the same way that we want to teach him about how to walk, with the Lord and do his best to be reconciled to God and repent of his sins. Like, this is a sin that has to be talked about in our home.
Yeah.
And so for us, it starts with meaningful conversations. And it starts with, smaller stuff, of course, of, okay, he's not just playing with kids who look like him. Another thing that we can do is making sure a simple thing is making sure his bookshelf is diversified, that he's not just having books of kids who look like him, or he's not watching videos just of kids who look like him. And that's just a very simple yet profound step that we can take as parents. But really where the heart of that will stem, and specifically racism, will be those meaningful conversations at a young age. Research shows by the age of 2, I think even younger, that kids are already starting to associate their race against another race. And by the time they're 4, they're able to, discriminate. They're able to say, and we've had experiences like that of, I don't want to play with that kid because of the color of his skin, or because he's more brown than I am. And so realizing that, it's like, okay, we have to start now. And him being a baby, he's just about to turn 1, but that's where I was saying those small, simple steps that add up, and they're the intentional steps starting now of, who's on his bookshelf, who's he listening to, what is he growing up hearing, who is he learning from, and but those meaningful conversations, when I think of a meaningful conversation, it's not something in passing. It's not meaningful if I'm, hey Robbie, how are you? Oh, good, I'm glad you're good. See you later. If I want to be in relationship with Robbie or Brooke or Tevin or Craig, I have to sit down and have those long conversations, and be willing to open up that floor for him of, hey, here's things that you're going to see, that you're going to experience. And I want him to be able to come to me to ask questions and to want to learn. But again, taking that back to, what does the Bible say about it, and what does God call us to be, and who does he call us to be as Christians? And if that's love your neighbor, but here's what loving your neighbor looks like. Not just stopping at go love all people, but here's what that's going to look like, and in different situations. So it honestly, we've already started. He's not even a year old, and we've started just obviously not having conversations with him. We're not sitting him down as a one-on-one, but just those simple steps of, who's he playing with? His bookshelf, even just the little songs that we play on the radio. We know it starts here, and it starts now.
Awesome. I love you said that, because I believe it's taught, right? It's taught. Like, a 4-year-old doesn't just necessarily just wake up one day and was like, I don't want to play with that kid. It's taught, know, and maybe it's intentional or unintentional, And I know for you, Brooke, you mentioned earlier your son being much older than a 1-year-old. How has that been for you as a mom, as a parent, parenting a teenager, especially through all this?
That's a whole other. So my son is 14, and I have a daughter that's 11.
Okay.
And I think everything that you said is exactly, you know, how we started and how we wanted things, you know, for them. I think it's important just to teach them that their identity is in Jesus, and it's not in what the world tells them they are. And so that's been a lot of kind of what we're feeding them, right? For us, so we started having real specific racial conversations with Jace when he was 9, which was 5 years ago, which was around the Emmanuel shooting, because he was in school, and so he had to hear it from us before he heard it from school. And so one bright light in talking about really dark things was that I'm gonna cry.
It's okay.
My son ended up being baptized and confessing Jesus just a couple of weeks later.
Wow.
This wasn't supposed to happen today.
That's fine.
But so it's like finding the words to encourage even through the pain, right? And there are hard things that, you know, that he and his sister are going to experience and have experienced, and just bringing Jesus to that and showing him, you know, showing our kids what that looks like.
So good.
So
good.
And I love that because it's Jesus shines brightest in the darkness, and that just, you know, which thank you for sharing that, because it just reminded me that these conversations are hard and it's such a darkness, but what a gift that we don't have to just stop our conversation with our kids at the darkness. Like, we have the light of the gospel to bring in and to infuse into that darkness, and that's such a gift to know. And it's just so hopeful thinking of him growing up, of like, it's gonna, these conversations are gonna be really hard. But we're just, I mean, I can't imagine having these conversations without the truth of the gospel and the light to infuse into that.
Very different.
Very different. Very different. Robbie, what about you as a dad?
So it's interesting because one of the things my wife is having to deal with is, like, you know, in the midst of these conversations the past couple months, it's brought up a lot of stuff for her. She's half Caucasian, half Filipina. Most people think she's Latina. And my kids, they just have their own look, you know. They really do. We always try to figure out, like, who they look like. If they look more like her, or more like me, and we've settled on, they have their own look. Whatever that look is, they both have it. Like, you know. But there was a real statement that Elizabeth said. She was like, you know, she was crying, and she was just like, I honestly found myself being thankful that, you know, my kid's skin was lighter than yours. She's like, and that is a terrible feeling for me, you know, because that's, you know, for the safety of our kids, you know, like, just in that aspect of it, just watching the world the past couple of months has been really challenging.
Sure.
You know, and it's not challenging just because of me or whatever, but it's challenging because of our children. And because we're, you know, we say that our parents crawled so that we could walk. We walked so that they could run, you know, and like each generation just trying to make it better, you know. And so right now I feel like we are walking so that our children can run. And I really, you know, we both believe that our kids are going to make this place, they're going to make it better, for sure. Like right now we're dealing with this and we'll be dealing with it for a while. But our kids' generation, they're definitely going to make it way better. And so we do a lot of the same things. Like we have some books that some friends have gifted us, and some that we just, you know, they know what we value and they value the same thing. And so we have some books that are helpful, constantly like surrounding with different styles of music, and movies with different casts, and, you know, like, but then another thing is just like naturally being around lots of cultures. So my son, his name is Bear, and he's 6 months old, and and it's interesting because most of his life has been in quarantine, and so so he hasn't seen many people. And my daughter Adelina, she is the life of the party, of any party. Like she's always been that way. Like, We bring her to any church and she just takes off, meets people. Bear's almost the opposite. Like, he just takes everything in, and like everything is a new experience. Every person is a new experience. So when somebody comes to our house, especially if they're a different color or something, then he stares and he takes it in. He's making conclusions. He's seeing if we say that they're safe. He's seeing how we treat those situations. And it's a beautiful thing because we see it as like a big value. And so, like you were talking about teaching it or not teaching it, sometimes it is like kind of they're being taught by not being taught kind of deal. Because some of that is natural. It's just exposure. Like you said, I'm like from Ohio. My dad's from Ohio, by the way, and my wife's family too. But yeah, like if you're not around, if you're not around something, and then you're confronted with it, there's like a fear of the unknown. So yeah, we try to have conversations, but we also just like try lots and lots of exposure, and making it normal.
You talk about exposure, especially in light of like COVID-19 and even talking about like a regular common cold or something, it's like not necessarily the exposure, right? That what we're dealing with is exposure, and it's not necessarily just intentionally taught, but also can be caught, you know what I mean?
Right.
I love that you said that. And Craig,
for
you, I would love to just hear from you, man.
What I love hearing is this. I hear you all really being intentional about how you're parenting, because what you're talking about, as I would define it, is you're making disciples of your children that want to follow Jesus and be like him. And so I love the taught and caught dynamic. And that's something that I think for us in our home throughout the years, man, you look back and go, man, I wish I'd have done these things, right? So you always have regrets and things you didn't do. But the things that we did try to do was to create our home as an environment where our kids could be taught and could catch the fact that God so loves the world. So one of the things that we intended to do from the very beginning in their early years, even in our personal lives and ministry, was to make sure that we were somewhere in a cross-cultural experience every year. And when our kids got to the age that they could go with us, then it was more than just them hearing at the dinner table. In fact, I remember having on our dinner table the map of the world. And sitting around the table, it had a piece of glass on top of it, so we can just look down at the world, and we would try to remember to pray for some people group around the world. It begins to shape the heart to say, the world's bigger than me. And God created this big place where there's a lot of people that don't look like me. And so let's go right to Revelation and say, there's a choir, in fact, that's warming up. They're singing from every tongue and tribe. So we would try to even bring missionaries into our house as part of the catching. The caught part is to have them in our home and stay with us. And then when they're of age, we do short-term mission projects. So here's how it played out. All right, so we're putting those seeds in the ground like y'all are, and we would water the seeds. We put fertilizer on it. We'd encourage it. We talk about the fact that God loves the world and all people belong to him. My daughter, Lindsay, she married a Costa Rican. And the reason why she did that is because she wanted to go over to Costa Rica to learn Spanish because God put in her heart to be a missionary. So I thought, man, Lord, this is huge. I can't believe this. My daughter's going to be a missionary in a foreign field, marrying to some guy I don't know from some other country. Am I okay with that, right? But where my heart got settled is that I should expect that outcome because that's what we shaped, right? That's the environment we created. So for her, that was her decision to say, I want to marry someone in that context where I want to live and serve. And so they're both here now because he had to come over here, the fiance visa, in order to get this whole thing connected and hooked up. And so they're living in North Charleston doing Latino ministry there. And so I just love the fact the way that God wrote these things in our kids' hearts, and you pray and you labor. You don't know what the outcome is, like the farmer. All you know to do is that you just wake up in the morning and there's the crop. But you labor in it. So you say, God, thank you for your grace because you made this happen. But you also recognize that it was the labor of your hands that sowed the seeds in the ground. So I want to commend you all, and I want to commend you as you think about this for your future.
No, I'm learning. I'm just learning.
You're making deposits. You're doing the taught and the caught. That both of those elements are important because we're always looking to form. So discipleship with children is formative and corrective. There's going to come that time, when our kids and your kids are going to show the face of racism and prejudice. And you got to correct it in the moment. But if you're doing a lot more of the formative and the shaping of that, you'll find that they'll be able to correct themselves because they know what's right. And this is where I think society will be greatest impacted is when homes like this are doing it at a day-to-day level,
Yeah.
and they're really trying to integrate that into the life of the child, so that as they get old, they will not depart from that way.
Yeah.
Right?
Amen.
That's so key.
Amen. That's a real promise from God, and I love that. And I'm encouraged listening to you guys. Like I said, I don't have kids, but just learning in this moment from all of you and from hearing from your experiences, I'm encouraged. Good. I really am. I'm encouraged, and I'm grateful. I know for my parents, I see it from how I was raised, and you talk about the experience with your wife and just the conflict, the tension, with the color of your kid's skin. And I remember when all of this was happening, like, it's tough conversation. It wasn't easy. I remember talking to my mom on the phone and her just being really honest, like, I'm afraid. I'm afraid for you and your brother. I'm afraid that, your name may come across a TV and for no other reason but because you were judged because of the color of your skin,
right.
And that's hard to hear as a son. That's hard to hear my mom say that. And I'm grateful for how my mom and dad, I was privileged enough to have both my parents in the home. I was privileged that they taught us, right and wrong, and that some of our closest friends were people that my mom or dad worked with, and they were people of different race backgrounds, and that shaped a lot of how I viewed the world. And so when I think what we can learn something from kids, like when a kid makes a friend, they say, hey, I made a friend today, and I think sometimes maybe when we get older, we kind of are more aware of race and things like that. And maybe I remember my parents maybe sometimes saying, well, what do they look like? For kids, that matters. It's like, what do you mean? They're my friend, right?
Would you ask that?
Yeah. But I'm encouraged to know that, for you guys, and I know the communities that we each represent, that work is being done. The labor that you're talking about, Craig, is being done. And so I'm so encouraged by that. Well, hey, I know for us three, especially sitting on this couch right now, just from hearing your experiences and getting to know you, all three of us are in interracial marriages. And so my wife is a white woman. And so you're saying your wife is half Filipino,
half Filipino.
And then your husband being a black man. For you, Brooke, have you faced any tensions, like in your context and your experience of being a white woman married to a black man, especially in today's world?
I think the thing for me has been, especially recently, my husband has been grieving in a way that I've never experienced over these last couple of months. Like, things like this have happened, but for whatever reason, George Floyd hit the community, the country in a whole different way. And so that's been a new experience for us, or at least it's felt very different in our home. So walking through these conversations, he's tired and he's grieving, and so I've had to kind of learn how to walk alongside him in a new way, like a different, like I can advocate. That's my go-to. Like I'm a counselor. I know that, right? But walking through grief and anger and really hard emotions with my husband this time has just felt so different. And so that has been hard in a new way. Did that answer your question?
No, it totally did. It totally did. And I guess I want to hear from your perspective, Robbie, as a husband, and for your wife, like, how has that dynamic been in these days, just in your marriage and the relationship between you and your wife?
Well, it's definitely got its challenges for sure. I would say that Elizabeth is way more vocal than I am. Imagine that about these issues, and she is a very, very wise woman, and has done, I've learned so much from her experiences as well, because she's had her own experiences, even just growing up in a small town and where she was one of the only brown people. And even though she was multiracial, like she was one of the only brown people, and she was told from a very young age that multiracial relationships were wrong. So imagine growing up, like in the school, the teachers saying this, and you're the only brown one, so you're like, well, I'm the product of something that's wrong, So there's just been lots of things that she's walked through. I mean, we joke all the time because like from a young age, she's studied and done research papers on Harriet Tubman, and like all these great heroic people that have helped, in the same, manner. And here we are, like, we've always appreciated each other for our differences and what we bring to the table. And so we really, like, even our house, like, we always have operated under a very multicultural background. Like, it's not something that we intentionally just do. It's just we bring our cultures and we find freedom in that, So we might have some fried chicken and some lumpia, or whatever. Like, it might look very different. But yeah, so it's definitely been something to walk through. It makes us stronger, it definitely, it stretches us in very new ways. We've had our own experiences of racial discrimination, either within the two of us, or like she has seen me be discriminated against, in ways that makes her very uncomfortable and on edge. So we've had to heal from a lot of that stuff. And I think we're still in the process of some of that, as things come up, but it also brings and informs our conversation with our kids, because it's not just two babies. We adopted our niece, who's a 16-year-old black girl as well. So there's conversations there too, there's just like lots of that, but that's what we welcome. Like our family pictures are very, very colorful, and that is normal, like that. I love that has become so normal, within that. So definitely lots of processing.
I know for me and my wife, there sometimes it's like, go to pick for a movie, or something. It's like, I'm gonna pick this movie right here, It's like Friday, for instance. Friday, this is for the culture. This is for the culture.
There's communication differences too sometimes. What did she just say just now?
And those are pretty light and funny moments. And I know when I explained to my wife, it's like, hey, like you watch this movie, you will understand and like be able to relate to my dad on a whole new level. And for her, like while it's fun and we laugh about it, it's a window into like my upbringing and like experiences that I grew up with, and like you said, we only come out stronger from those moments, and she does the same for me. Like TV shows or things, and it's like, not that I think her experiences or her upbringing was wrong. It's not any of that. It's just like, hey, like, while she maybe grew up watching what's the name of the show?
Friends?
No, the Full House. Full House. It's like, you grew up watching Full House. I grew up watching Good Times. So just those differences and being able to explain to each other. Like, I'm asking questions about those little things, and we get to go deeper as well in those conversations. And I want to circle back to you, Brooke, because you were talking about just right now in this season of life for you and in your marriage, it just being different, and that's what you said. How practically are you like supporting your husband as he navigates some of this?
As carefully as I can. I mean, like I said, this feels new. I'm connected to the community because I'm in an advocacy role. So like I said, I kind of jump into all the cases and all the things that have happened throughout the year, so I can learn and grow and figure out where we can help and support. But this one is more personal. Like, my husband has kind of distanced himself in the past, whereas this one felt personal. And so for me, supporting him really just looks like giving him space, right? Like giving him space where he can grieve and process and figure out what he needs. And he doesn't really know right now. Like, that's what I'm learning, like, because I'm a fixer, right? Like, I'm a counselor. I want to, like, let's walk through it. Let's, let's talk about it. Let's do it. But sometimes he just needs to grieve and to sit with his feelings and just let him be. Let him, let him protect his heart in the way that he needs to. Let him kind of make sure that he's got safe community around him, make sure that he feels that like he has the support that he needs. But I'm also not necessarily the only answer for him. Right? Like, he's got family and he's got support that understand exactly what he feels. And I might not. And so being able to to give space and to, to be whatever he's asking for and not push if I don't, if it's not the time. And there's kind of an ebb and flow to that, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's me and sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah. That's good. I love that. And I feel like that's the humility piece that Craig was mentioning earlier in Philippians 2, and just being able to like understand and recognize that and not take it personal. Like I feel like you could quickly be offended or quickly be hurt by that, and but that's extremely encouraging. And honestly, for me as well, like again, I was telling Craig earlier, I just celebrated a year of marriage back in March. So like we're new to this thing. We're new to this, and like it's definitely. And my wife grew up in Pennsylvania, so she grew up in an environment, and she was it was majority white, and she didn't have any African Americans going to her high school, or she didn't really see it a lot, or at her dinner table, and so. All this is new to her. Yeah. And so and there's a lot of grace. There's a lot of grace, and there's a lot, just in knowing, hey, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And I think just going back to what we were saying earlier, just like understanding that and as best as we can, just help to bring awareness to one another, help better understand the experiences that we've all had. And so I want to ask this, and this is as we wrap up, and I would love to maybe hear from everybody. For people who are watching, for people maybe around this topic, like how can people be involved in change? Like when people say, like, what do you want me to do? Like, how can people get involved in being a part of change? And I'll start with you, Emily.
Ooh. Yeah. I'm looking at Robbie.
I was like, Emily, you got this.
Let him take it.
It's coming through.
I think the first thing to do is we have to reflect personally, and a little bit of what I was saying earlier. We've got to allow Jesus. We've got to humble ourselves, lay down our pride, and allow Jesus to really search our heart and to ask Him, like, Lord, where am I wrong? Where are my blind spots, as Brooke was saying earlier? Where are my hidden biases? Where am I perpetuating this sin? And what is the solution? Yeah. And so first and foremost, starting with that, and we've all kept saying, like, using the Bible as our guide. Starting with that, because there are so many resources out there, which would be my next step for people. There are so many books, there are so many websites and podcasts and history books that we can go out and we can find and we can learn from. And so, just starting there and starting just with this process, they say doing work that dismantles racism is work. Like, it's work, and work requires time and intentionality. And so starting with yourself and starting just like with your just relationship with the Lord of, okay, Lord, search me. And then moving forward to, okay, what's next? What does that look like? I'm going to read some books, or I'm going to sit down and I'm going to have some conversations. And I'm just going to just dive into this. And I think when we begin to do that, we begin to open up doors to learn what we didn't already learn. And it really is, I don't know. I think you were saying it, Robbie. I can't remember exactly what you were saying, but basically, I'm blanking on it. But something like, it's joyful when you realize. What were you saying?
Yeah, whenever, based off of, once you learn something, you can't unlearn it.
Yes.
And so when you've experienced something new, something beautiful, you don't want to go back.
Yes. I love that, because the work of reconciliation, and it's same thing as like discipling someone. Like when we disciple someone and they choose to follow the Lord and they get baptized, it's kind of like this Jesus high of like, oh, I want more people to get to the kingdom of God. It's like, taste and see. And it's just that same thing of just wanting to disciple people and wanting to have the conversations. And I think, one piece of encouragement is, I know and I trust and believe that we as Christians, like, we're the people for the job. We know what it looks like to follow somebody who left his throne to come to earth and to take human form, laid down all of his privileges. We know what that looks like. Like, we have the perfect example of what it looks like. And we can if we're truly following Jesus, to lay down that pride, to lay down our privileges,
That's right.
and to just be humble enough and model the heart of Jesus, to sit and learn and be in relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where I could keep going, but that's where I'd start. Start there.
No, that's so good. That's so good. That's so good. Wait.
Yes.
You want to follow that?
I do, yeah, sorry. It's a good word.
You bring the wisdom to
No,
me.
Right.
To
What I
my,
caught from you is the idea that we just need to focus on what's next. And I think too often we try to eat the elephant all at one time.
Yes.
Just try to do what's next.
Yeah.
What is God saying to you now? What do you need to take another step to do? I like what you said too. We often stay at the place of, I don't know what I don't know, and I don't. We can't stay there.
Yeah.
Right.
And I know we all agree with that. And that's what this conversation's about.
Yeah.
Is I don't want to not know what I shouldn't know. I want to know what I need to know.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think fast forward, that's where I think with George Floyd, there's just been like this awakening, not only for Black culture, but for white culture as well.
Yeah.
And so what's been joyful in my heart is to see churches around the greater Charleston area say, we're going to leverage our voice in the pulpit and speak to what Micah 6:8 says. What does it mean to do justice? What does it mean to love mercy? What does it mean to walk humbly with your God? And what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And it's unprecedented in Greater Charleston that this has happened. Now, we can't stop here either.
Sure.
Right.
So,
That's good.
my good friend Philip Pinckney he's one of my mentors in this whole reality about how do we think about where we are. And so we've got to, first of all, he says it this way, he says, first of all, we got to get caught up. We've got to get caught up on what we don't know and start taking responsibility. So when I met with about a dozen white pastors in intra-racial meeting, I said, listen, let's not lay it on the back of our Black brothers and sisters to ask the question, what do we do now?
Yeah.
It's like me saying to my wife, tell me how I should love you now. Right?
Right.
No, that's on me.
Yeah.
I've got to figure that out. Now I need to listen, right?
Sure.
But I want to make sure that I'm bearing the burden that I'm called to bear.
That's good.
So get caught up. Then he says, we need to look up. We need to look at God and say, God, there's no way that this is of human origin or even human sustainability. You have to continue to work, and we're looking to you. So God, what I don't know, help me follow you. Then thirdly, he said, then we've got to be willing to keep up. In other words, it's not just a one and done.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that churches and even our own personal lives, that we got to keep looking in to say, where's the gospel not informing us, and where does it need to inform us to take the next step?
Yeah.
Then lastly, he says you need to stand up. And that means you stand up for what you believe. So you move from knowledge, and knowledge applied is wisdom. But wisdom doesn't stop with just application.
Yeah.
It becomes understanding, is what Solomon said. And
Yeah.
understanding means I'm changing the way that I not only think or what I believe, but I'm changing the way that I live.
Yeah.
That's a whole different thing, right? So when you're at that point, you're standing up on something new. You're standing on new convictions and values.
Yeah.
And you're standing beside your brother and sister who's not like you. And the greatest thing we can do, I believe, is be an advocate.
Yeah.
And that's what Jesus is for us. We pray, and he's the advocate to the Father. We need to advocate for one another, especially if God has placed you in skin that has privilege or advantage. Leverage that in advocacy. So my heart's just working through all those things. And I'm asking myself the question, how do those 4 gears operate in my life every year? And my wife and I and our family, and then ultimately in the church. How does that begin to become almost like a system of how I'm continuing to move from the one thing to the next thing?
Yeah.
That's
so good. That's being changed by Jesus.
That's
what I hear from that. That's being changed by Jesus.
Absolutely.
And as you're saying that, in Acts chapter 10, like the interaction with Peter and Cornelius, that's literally Peter's brought to his awareness, his blind spots, as you mentioned earlier, like his blind spots are now aware to him, and now Peter had to move to action. Once he was made aware, he moved to action, and then that advanced the early church to move and go towards Gentiles, and now we get to be a part of that. We get to be a part of that movement because of the obedience and the humility that Peter took back in Acts chapter 10. You guys have anything to add to that? How can people be a part of change?
I think, y'all said a lot.
Yeah. So good.
I think the thing that I keep repeating to my friends is that this work is a marathon and it's not a sprint,
Yes.
right? So like
Well said.
everybody wants to fix it all right now, but it can be so exhausting.
Sure.
Yep.
And so I think that that's just really, really important to remember as you're walking through and learning, especially if you're kind of new and just having your eyes open to these things. And so it's just slow down. Like it's okay. It's okay to take breaks. It's
Right.
okay to take care of yourself.
Yes.
You know, as you're still learning. I think that, you know, what the churches are doing is beautiful. It's something that I know our family has cried out for to many churches throughout the years and gotten a response that wasn't this.
Yes.
And so, so it's beautiful. And I think that once you're along the way, once you have learned and have some experience and have some conversations where you mess up, because we're gonna mess up. We're gonna say things that we shouldn't have said, and we're gonna say, "I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't know." But once you kind of have some of those experiences, you know, we all have a platform, right? Like whether we realize it or not. Like it may be at a church, it may be within our family, it may be in our friend groups, it may be social media. I don't know if it's social media, but it might be. But it's like we have places where we have influence, and so we can always be using our voices and our influence for good. And so I think like the mental health community is a place where I'm trying to evaluate. It's a new place for me, right? I've been in it for a while, but it's a place I hadn't considered. And so even, you know, doing this kind of work for almost 20 years, right? Like there's still this place where I'm like, oh, you know, I haven't considered, like I have a voice in this community. What can I bring to that? And so finding places where I can speak to that, or where I can learn more about African Americans and mental health, and you know, like different things like that. And so finding the place where you have a natural platform that you've built over the years and utilizing that influence in that way, just like the churches are doing right now. They have a pulpit, but we all have a platform.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's good. It's good.
That's so good. That's so good.
I think also just doing the work, like you said, like of educating ourselves.
Sure.
I am in my mid-30s now, being made aware of so many things that I had no idea about, you know, just growing up, especially growing up here in Charleston, you know, and being desensitized to so many things.
Yeah.
And now I'm educating myself, I'm learning so many things, and I think we have to kind of be in that position constantly, but taking breaks, taking a rest, realizing that it's a marathon, not a sprint, and you're not going to solve all the world's problems. Like I think that's a big thing, you know, it's like people just want it to be better, and that's great, but it's not going to just be better. You know, like, you know, it's not a 3-step program, you know, to do that. And so we're creating better realities through our spheres of influence. But I think some things that we can do is give people a chance to work in positions that you probably wouldn't typically consider. You know, that's like one practical step. So like think about like the infrastructures of the organizations that you're part of, schools, churches, all of that, and look at the palette, you know, and see like what voices are the ones that are making decisions and why is that, you know, like thinking through those kinds of things. And sometimes that can create a, you know, like create an awareness in us to say, oh, maybe there was some underlying implicit bias that has caused us to get to this position here, you know? And so let's see, what can we do to fix that? You know, like, is there someone from another culture that has the qualifications, but may approach situation in a way that's different than me, that might actually help to enhance our experience here and be more inviting for more people? So like, I think thinking through that as much as possible. Also creating this like relational barometer within yourself, and realize, like you said, like your husband, like being sensitive to know like people are in different places. Some people do not want to talk about this right now, you know, and they're in a place like sometimes they might be hurting and they just need a chance to heal, like recognize where they are and like either bringing them one step closer or just leave them alone until they get one step closer, you know. And then people who are ready to go there really foster those relationships, and you know, we do that just from relationship building. And you know, some of my friends are saying what you said, like everybody is asking me what to do to make this better, but there are books and there's media and there are all these things. And so what are your ideas? What do you bring to the table that you feel like will make this better instead of, so all that, just being sensitive and being really intentional about opportunities that you're offering people and how you get to those decisions.
Oh, that's so good, man. So good. And I just want to again thank you guys. Like I'm taking away from all this relationship that we carry the gospel as Christ followers, and that we just be intentional. We be intentional with the environments that we have, and again, I want to thank each of you for making the time to be here and to do this. And I'm encouraged, and I have said before, we can, as Christ followers, we should be some of the most joyful people around, right? And joy is not saying that that's the absence of like troubles and hard times. It's not to say that we can't be sad, but joy is it's a perspective, it's a position that we have in Christ, and the joy is the fulfillment and longing for better days to come. And I'm encouraged as a Christ follower because my brothers and sisters in Christ and the people, the groups, the communities, the organizations that we all represent, we're in the fight. We're doing the work as we talked about, and I'm encouraged because I believe the better days are ahead of us. If not necessarily for us, but for our kids and their kids, for the generations to come behind us. And so I'm encouraged, and thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for making time to have this conversation.
Thank you, Tevin.
So great, thank you.